Okay, we are back with the next chapter of Peter and the Sword of Mercy. This is chapter 22, Danger Coming, and we will be with Molly. In this chapter, it's that typical short little chapter before we jump into a longer chapter back with Wendy. So each day, Molly fought a grim battle against loneliness and despair. Nobody spoke to her. She called out to the guards, pleading with them for information or even just human conversation, but they never answered. And so she sat day after day in a tiny, dank, foul-smelling cell, sometimes sobbing quietly, sometimes talking to herself, finding it harder and harder to keep out the awful thought. I'm never getting out of here. She had no way to mark the passage of time except for the delivery of the awful food and the wretched twice-a-day spectacle of the exhausted prisoners trudging past. She dared not call out to them for fear the guards would hurt them, but she waited for them eagerly, listening for the clanking of their chains in the hallway, pressing her face to the cell bars in anticipation of the only real human contact in her otherwise relentlessly bleak day. And as the prisoners passed, she and James always met eyes, each trying to cheer each other up, to communicate the simple message, I'm still here, I'm still alive. But James was not the only prisoner with whom she exchanged looks. She now was certain that she knew who the fourth man in line was, the one who had looked at her so intently when she arrived. It took her several minutes to recognize him, but once she did, she was sure. It was Thomas. He had clearly been down in the tunnels longer than the others. His face was gaunt, his arms and legs bone thin, his filthy clothes nothing but shreds and tatters. But it was Thomas. Molly had spent a great deal of time she was the only thing she had, thinking about what his presence meant. She understood why James had been taken captive. He had learned of von Schotten's secret, but as far as Molly knew, Thomas knew nothing about von Schotten, yet he had apparently been taken captive before either James or Molly. Why? The more Molly thought about it, the more certain she became that the reason had to be the island. Very few people even knew it existed, and Thomas had actually lived there. Molly believed that this was why he had been captured. Von Schotten or Ambra, or whatever he was, wanted Thomas's knowledge of the island. And if Molly was right, there was a connection between the island and the strange activity in the underground. What was it? Molly didn't know the answer, but she knew that whatever it was, it could only mean trouble for the island and for her dear friends who lived there. She wished there was some way she could send a warning to let Peter and the mollusks know that they were in danger, but she couldn't even get a message to the streets of London above her, let alone to an island far out to sea. She could only clutch the bars of her tiny, dim cell, waiting for the next brief glimpse of James and Thomas, her next brief chance to exchange the unspoken message that had become the only thing any of them had left. I'm still alive. Okay, and chapter 23 is called Signposts in the Sea, and we're back with Wendy. Wendy hated herself for what she was about to do to Uncle Neville, but it's for Mother, she kept telling herself. But that didn't make her feel any better. She returned the evening before. Uncle Ted, who'd stayed in Harwich, had tried to talk her out of her plan, but Wendy could not be budged. His last words to her as he put her on the train were, Wendy, you're ever bit as stubborn as your mother. I just hope you're as clever. I hope so too, said Wendy. She took a taxicab from Cambridge to Uncle Neville's house. Nobody seemed suspicious. Apparently Mrs. Blotney hadn't even noticed the Harwich postmark on Wendy's letter. The next morning, Wendy awakened early to fill a cloth bag with supplies. Bread, cheese, 3 apples, and a bottle of water. An hour later, after breakfast, she peppered Uncle Neville with questions about the ornithopter. He was happy to answer them. In fact, the ornithopter was all he ever wanted to talk about, so he was giddy with anticipation, having finally finished repairing the odd-looking craft. He intended, despite Mrs. Blotney's heartfelt pleadings, to make a test flight after breakfast. John and Michael were so excited they could barely stay in their chairs. Every few seconds, Michael would shout, Uncle Neville's going to fly the ornithopter. And each time he emitted a spray of toast crumbs. And each time John corrected him, saying, It's ornithopter, you ninny. But they were both too excited to get into a serious argument. Meanwhile, Wendy kept pressing for information. She had gotten Uncle Neville to explain the controls, which were quite simple. There was a lever for up and down and another one for steering. But the next issue was more worrisome. So the motor, said Wendy. It uses gasoline? Oh, yes, said Uncle Neville. It's quite a reliable motor. It has 2 cylinders and a 4-stroke. I see, said Wendy. How long does the motor keep going before it runs out of fuel? Uncle Neville looked at the ceiling and scratched his cheek, thinking. I don't know, actually, since it has never operated under full flight conditions for more than a few minutes without, crashing, said Mrs. Blotney. Quite so. But I imagine that with a full tank of fuel, it would run for, 3 or 4 hours? Wendy gulped. Will the tank be full today? Oh, yes, I always fill it just in case, said Uncle Neville. Although I'm planning just a short flight today. I won't be going to France. Not yet. Wendy tried to smile, but her mind was buzzing with troubling thoughts. 3 or 4 hours? That didn't sound like nearly enough time, but it would have to do. All right, then, said Uncle Neville, wiping his mouth and tossing his napkin on the table as he rose. Wind is down and the sun is up. Time to fly, boys. And with a whoop apiece, John and Michael were racing to the front door. Uncle Neville was right behind, followed by Wendy, who was holding her cloth bag. A very unhappy Mrs. Blotney was following. 2 minutes later, Uncle Neville and the boys were swinging open the big barn doors, and just inside the ornithopter was waiting for them, its feathered wings arching out on both sides like enormous eyebrows. Uncle Neville and the boys took hold of the ornithopter and began rolling it out of the barn on its 4 small wire-spoke wheels. Wendy was to help them, and as she grasped the wooden frame, she was struck by how flimsy it was. It was just sticks, really. The wings looked especially frail, literally made from feathers, ostrich ones. They were connected by wire cables and the 2 large control levers mounted next to the platform where the pilot stood. There were small levers also, connected by a cable to the motor, and Wendy assumed this was the throttle. The motor itself looked a bit more substantial than the rest of the craft, but Wendy knew nothing about what made it work. Its wires, its belts, its hoses were a mystery. She did notice with relief that the fuel tank was on the side of the motor facing the pilot platform. When the ornithopter had been wheeled into place, Uncle Neville lugged a red metal can out of the barn. Wendy touched her gold locket and watched closely as he unscrewed the cap on top of the fuel tank and filled it with gasoline. He put the cap back on, tightened it, and wiped the tank with a rag. Then he spent a few minutes inspecting the motor and making some small adjustments. All right, then, it's time. I'll go call the doctor, said Mrs. Blotney, turning away, unable to watch. You boys stand back, said Uncle Neville, shooing John and Michael a few feet farther from the ornithopter. The instant he was done shooing, they moved right back to where they had been. Uncle Neville was busy with the starter crank on the front of the motor and wasn't watching the boys. He also wasn't watching Wendy, who was clutching her bag and had stepped around the back of the ornithopter and moved next to the platform. Ready? Said Uncle Neville. Ready, shouted John and Michael. Uncle Neville grabbed the starter crank in both hands and gave it a yank. The motor coughed, then sputtered to life, and the boys cheered. The giant wings started moving, rising slowly, then descending. Uncle Neville was making one last adjustment to the motor. Now, thought Wendy. She climbed up onto the platform. The engine roared as Uncle Neville finished his adjustment. The big feathered wings began sweeping up and down, kicking up the dust. On each downbeat, the ornithopter jumped a foot off the ground, then settled back down on its little wheels. Hurry, Uncle Neville, shouted John. Uncle Neville was already bustling around the side of the ornithopter, avoiding one of the huge flapping wings. He stopped suddenly when he saw Wendy. Wendy, he shouted over the sputtering motor, get down from there. I'm so sorry, Uncle Neville, she said. She put her hand on the throttle lever. No, said Uncle Neville, and Wendy pushed the lever all the way forward. The motor belched black smoke and then roared much louder. The wings beat faster, and with a whoosh, the ornithopter shot gracefully forward and upward. Here's a picture of Wendy stealing the ornithopter from Uncle Neville. I really like that the authors still made sure that she had her locket on, and I like the perspective, so you can check out the ornithopter, check her out, and see Uncle Neville. Despite his concerns, Uncle Neville could not help but pause for a moment to admire the brilliance of his invention. With a child at the controls, it was actually flying. Then he remembered the danger, and he lunged forward. He managed to get one hand on one of the wheels, but the next downbeat of the wings knocked him back, and the ornithopter shot upward and forward, gaining altitude. Another flap of the wings, and it was well out of reach, rising steadily as it flew across the open field. Uncle Neville ran behind, trailed by John and Michael, all three shouting and jumping, but Wendy couldn't hear them over the sound of the motor and the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. She was flying. The ornithopter was now 50 feet in the air and had begun to lean to the right, first slightly, then more sharply. Suddenly, it was losing altitude. Wendy grabbed one of the levers and pulled it. This corrected the tilt for a moment, but then sent the ornithopter in the direction so far to the left that Wendy nearly fell off the platform. After several seconds of panic, she managed to get the craft level again, and it resumed its rise. She was starting to get the hang of this. Her uncle's field was well behind her now. She was crossing over a line of trees and still gaining altitude. She looked down and felt a wave of nausea as she realized how high up in the air she was on this fragile, creaking craft, standing on a platform barely larger than a step stool. She began aware of how hard her heart was pounding. Concentrate, she told herself. Find the train tracks. She glanced back over her shoulder at her uncle's mansion, now in the distance. Off to her left, she could see the spires of Cambridge. From time to time, she thought she heard shouts from below, but instead, she didn't look down. She kept her eyes on the horizon. There it was. Beyond the next field, the train tracks ran along a raised bed perpendicular to Wendy's present course, and as she approached the tracks, she put the ornithopter into a gentle right turn until she was flying directly over them, or so she hoped. She followed the tracks, clutching the ornithopter's frame, passing over the towns and villages, listening to the whoosh of the wings and the roar of the motor. Occasionally, the motor would cough and Wendy's heart would stop. But then it would resume roaring again. She prayed it was reliable, as Uncle Neville has said. She had no watch. She had no idea what time it was and had no idea how long she'd been flying. But it felt like forever, an eternity, and she knew it was probably less than an hour. But when she saw the sea in the distance, she followed the tracks to Harwich and was comforted by the sight of the train station. She adjusted her course slightly to take her toward the harbor, reducing her height as she drew closer to the quay. It was busy with dock workers. One of them caught sight of the ornithopter. Soon all of them were pointing and shouting, some in fear as the strange flying craft bore down on them. But Wendy ignored them, her eyes searching the quay. Her heart leaped when she saw the bulky form of Uncle Ted at the very end, jumping up and down, waving both arms over his head to get her attention. And as she drew close, they made eye contact, and he pointed vigorously towards the harbor. Wendy looked, and she saw the sleek silver shape of a porpoise poking out of the water. She altered her course slightly, heading toward it, and the moment she did, the porpoise flashed its tail and dove underwater, then resumed a little bit further in the water. Wendy followed, and in a few moments she realized with alarm that she was flying much faster than the porpoise could swim. As she passed over, she looked down frantically, wondering what she was supposed to do. And then, there it was, 100 yards ahead, another grinning porpoise poking out of the water. Wendy aimed for it, followed it as far as she could, and then found the next porpoise, then the next one, then the next one, each one holding its grinning snout high, guiding her forward like signposts in the sea. For several minutes, Wendy was so focused on finding the next porpoise that she didn't look back. When she did, she saw that she was passing over the harbor breakwater and was already well out into the open sea. Harwich was receding behind her rapidly. Ahead lay only water, formless and dark. Wendy, for the first time, noticed the chill of the sea wind and the water, and she knew it would be colder. The engine coughed once, then resumed its steady roar. Wendy's hand gripped the steering lever. Shivering in the wind, she again looked back toward Harwich, toward land, toward safety. No, she said out loud. Then she turned forward for the next silver signpost in the endless dark green sea. And that is the end of that chapter. So we covered 2 chapters today, and you want to think about, even though Wendy's on her way to the island, what problems is she going to encounter while she's traveling on the ornithopter. I'll be back tomorrow. We should be with Scarlett Johns and the skeleton a little bit, and their first meeting with Wendy. So hope you're enjoying it, and I'll see you tomorrow.